British tank development was in a very weird state by the end of the Second World War. In 1940, they might not have been the front of the pack, but they had definitely caught up to the leaders after somewhat of a lull in the early to mid 1930s. However, by 1943, the best British tank looked like this. Now, that wasn't because the British had given up on tank development, far from it. It's just that their next generation tanks came a little bit later than that of the other nations. Let's talk about why that was, what the British were working on, and how the British tank forces would have been very, very different had the war gone on for even a few more months, let alone another year. As you probably know, British doctrine separated their tanks into two different classes. One was the cruiser tank. This was a relatively lightly armored but very, very fast tank meant for breakthrough exploitation. Some in other nations probably would have been called a light tank or maybe a medium tank, but the point of this tank was that it was really fast and could drive a very long distance into enemy rear in raid. The other kind of tank was the infantry tank. This was a tank designed for supporting infantry. They didn't really have to go very fast because infantry doesn't move very quickly. And so this tank could focus its efforts on armor. Generally, they had very thick armor. In other nations, these kinds of tanks would likely be known as heavy tanks. However, in 1941, the British noted that the winds were changing somewhat, and that in many nations they managed to have both a fast speed and thick armor in just one kind of tank. And so work began on a new concept that was called a universal tank or a heavy cruiser. The heavy cruiser was intended to have up to 3 inches of armor and a new 6-pounder gun. This tank received the designation Cruiser Tank Mark 7 and later the name Cromwell 1. So a prototype of the Cruiser Tank Mark 7 was ready in March of 1942, but trials dragged all the way into December. The problem was that the automotive components that were recycled from the Cruiser Tank Mark 6 or Crusader in order to speed up development were already overstressed on the 19-ton Crusader tank, and on the 24-ton Cromwell, well, they were even more overstressed, so this was not a particularly reliable machine. The other problem was that the British, by that point, had tried out the Sherman tank in the Battle of El Alamein, and it turned out that this was actually, well, a better universal tank. It was still quite fast, it had thicker armor than the Cromwell, the armor was sloped, and most importantly, it had a reliable engine. And also a new gun, which I will mention shortly. It really turned out that after about a year of work on this new tank, there really wasn't much to show. The Cromwell 1 was a dead end. Fortunately for the British, they were already working on a replacement for the aging Newfield Liberty engine. This engine was called the Meteor. It was an adaptation of the Rolls-Royce Merlin aircraft engine. It put out 600 horsepower, so it was a quite powerful and very good tank engine. A brand new tank was developed for this new engine. It was called the Cromwell 3. The interesting thing about the Cromwell 3 that put it apart from the Cromwell 1 was that it was developed with all new automotive components. So even though it followed the same standard of a cruiser tank with 3 inches of armor and a 6-pounder gun, it was a very different tank on the inside. Since there was a bit of a shortage of these brand new engines, an intermediate step was designed. This tank was called the Cromwell 2, and essentially it was the same thing as the Cromwell 3, it just used the same Liberty engine. The idea was that as more Meteors became available, these older tanks could be upgraded with a very quick and easy engine swap. In August of 1942, these tanks received new names. So the Cromwell 1 became the Cavalier, the Cromwell 2 became the Centaur, and the Cromwell 3 became the Cromwell 1. They didn't want to give a new name for it. Strangely enough, even though everyone agreed that the new Cromwell was superior to the other two types, development and production of all three continued in parallel. This included the development of a brand new gun, since the Sherman showed that its 75mm gun had far superior high explosive performance to the 6-pounder, and the armor-piercing performance was Well, it was worse than the 6-pounder, but it wasn't that much worse. And tanks spent more time shooting at soft targets than other tanks anyway. So the British decided to take this American gun and make a 75 millimeter gun with similar ballistics of their very own. Development of a 95 millimeter howitzer also began to replace the old 3-inch howitzer used on British close support tanks. I'm not going to get into the weeds of Cromwell development because this video isn't about the Cromwell, but suffice it to say that making all of these variants in parallel was not a easy undertaking. About 4,000 cruiser tanks of different types were built in 1943, and well, none of them were judged to be battle worthy. At most, these tanks could be used for training, or some of them were actually converted into artillery observer vehicles. As you can imagine, by the end of 1943, the enthusiasm about the new British Universal tank began to fade. The Cromwell kind of paled in comparison to the other tanks that we would call universal, the T-34. By that time, the T-34-85 was almost in production, the American Sherman, and by the end of 1943, the German Panther had arrived in the scene. All of these tanks had sloped armor that was joined by welding and more powerful weapons than the British 6-pounder. So, well, if all the British could hope for was to finish the Cromwell and put that out in the battlefield in 1944, they were going to be a step behind everyone else. And so development of 2 new tanks began in 1943 that were going to replace the Cromwell. The British had actually hedged their bets and went with one solution that was going to be a short-term solution, which was essentially a deep modernization of the Cromwell concept, and another one, which was a whole new tank that completely discarded everything that the British had established in their tank building tradition up to that point. So let's start with the first one, the modernization of the Cromwell. This tank received the General Staff Specification Index A34, and, well, it was pretty much just an upgraded Cromwell. The hull was based on the Cromwell Type F hull. It was widened in order to fit a larger turret ring. The turret that went on the A43 was actually completely new, very interesting and complex design, but the biggest advantage of it was that it was bigger and could therefore fit a more powerful weapon than the 75 millimeter. Now, the designers did realize that putting in the gun that they really wanted, the 17-pounder, they would have needed a very wide turret ring. And the wider the turret ring, the wider the hull, the more weight you gain, and more weight requires a new engine and new automotive components. And the goal of this tank was to put it into production as quickly as possible, and therefore a lot of components had to be reused. So they couldn't really build a turret big enough to fit the 17-pounder. However, the A34 did use a similar gun. It's called the 77 millimeter. It was actually pretty much just a 17-pounder, but it was shorter, and the size of the chamber was reduced in order to allow for smaller ammunition. Since the ammunition was not compatible, this gun was called 77 millimeter, even though the caliber was the same as that of the 17-pounder at 76 millimeters. Even though the strength of the gun was reduced and the muzzle velocity was reduced, this was still a very, very powerful weapon that could punch a hole through the front of any German tank, aside from maybe the King Tiger. However, nobody knew about the King Tiger yet, and so the A34 would have been a competitive opponent to any German tank it encountered on the battlefield. A prototype of the A34 tank was finished and entered trials in March of 1944. Interestingly enough, this was still several months before the Cromwell, the tank that it was going to replace, had seen battle. The prototype had some issues, but it showed that the idea of making a Super Cromwell was essentially correct. Trials had continued throughout the summer. No significant defects were found that couldn't be corrected. And so production of this tank began in the fall of 1944. It was accepted into service under the name Comet 1. The first Comet 1 tanks were completed in October. They were shipped to Europe, where they were issued to the 11th Armored Division in December of 1944. And the Comet had just about seen battle. Except the Germans started a little unrest in the Ardennes. And so the 11th Armored Division had to very quickly grab the tanks that they already had the training and the tools for, which were the Sherman tanks, and then go fight with those in the Ardennes. And the Comets had to wait their turn, and so training and re-equipment only began in January of 1945. So because of this delay, the Comets only ended up seeing battle in March of 1945 and only had time to fight for about 2 months before the war in Europe ended. They were met pretty positively, and after all, the Comet was a pretty decent tank, so not much to write home about. Maybe it was still more or less the equivalent of the Sherman and the T-34-85. It was definitely superior to the Panzer IV. So the British had finally caught up to their allies and, well, at least one of the medium tanks used by their opponents. Interestingly enough, a Comet was sent to the USSR for trials, and, well, the testers weren't all that impressed. However, the Comet wasn't supposed to be impressive. It was supposed to be good, not necessarily great. It was supposed to get the British back to where everyone else was in tank building, and most importantly, it was reliable. So the Comets actually enjoyed quite a long post-war service, first with the British, and then also with other nations, including Ireland, Finland, Cuba, a couple of others. Work on a true next-generation tank began in the fall of 1943. This development received the General Staff Index A41. The A41 was supposed to be a tank that was very well protected from the front, not so well protected from the sides, weighing about 40 tons. Now, a lot of people say, well, that sounds an awful lot like the Panther. However, in the fall of 1943, the General Staff would have only heard whispers about the Panthers. The British did not have time to examine a Panther tank until June of 1944. And so most likely the only inspiration for the A41 was the Tiger. In fact, it was specifically required for the front armor to be able to resist the 88mm gun used on the Tiger tank, and therefore the front armor would have to be between 4 and 5 inches. However, that turned out to be a problem. The prototype of the Comet, which was being worked on at the same time, already weighed 32 tons, and it had much less armor than what was being asked of the A41. And so the British had to change some more things. For one, the front armor stopped having that characteristic step shape that every single British tank had up to that point and became sloped. The sloped armor was initially 4 inches thick. Later, the requirement was lowered to just 3 inches. Rather than try to adapt Christie springs for such a heavy tank, the British decided to use a whole new kind of suspension, or rather, not that new. The Horstman spring suspension was previously used on British light tanks before World War II, but the good thing about that suspension was that it was much easier to scale it up to a 40-ton tank than it would be for the Christie vertical springs. Torsion bars were also considered, and that was a very nice, modern, progressive solution that the British were obviously aware of. However, there was one problem. Torsion bars take up space inside the tank, and they would have increased its height by about 100 millimeters, and the British wanted a lower profile, and so an externally mounted suspension was the way to go. The turret of this new tank was very similar to that of the Comet conceptually, but in the implementation was quite different. For one, the front armor was much thicker at 5 inches, and the other thing was that it had a very large turret bustle. That, combined with an increased size of the turret ring, meant that the A41 could mount a very large gun, even the full-size 17-pounder, although the 77mm gun was still considered to be a possible substitution. Not only that, but there was enough space to install a 20mm Polston or Oerlikon autocannon in a separate mount, allowing it to be aimed independently. However, there were still versions with a simple machine gun rather than a 20mm autocannon. In total, 20 pilot tanks were commissioned with very different combinations of these weapons, but the most important thing was that work on these also began quickly in January of 1945. Work on a pilot series of 20 tanks began in January of 1945, and the first tank had been completed by April. Around that time, there were plans to take 6 pilot tanks and send them to Europe for trial by combat, kind of like what the Americans did with their Pershing tank during the Zebra mission. That was all well and good, but unfortunately for this specific project, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945, and the A-41 tanks simply had nowhere to go. However, the British decided to send them to Europe anyway to be used as a part of the occupation force, just to get any kind of experience using these tanks somewhere outside of a proving grounds. 6 highly experienced crews were recalled from the 7th Armored Division to pick up these tanks in the United Kingdom and train with them before they went back to Europe to use as a part of the occupational duties. In August of 1945, a report was composed on how these tanks were used, and on August 22nd, the director of the Royal Armored Corps stated that these tanks had no serious defects and could be accepted into service under the name Centurion 1. So if you just look at the technical details of the Centurion Mark 1, it's not actually that impressive. I mean, the British ended up with a tank that had 3 inches of sloped front hull armor, a high velocity 3-inch gun, and relatively thin sides. Yeah, okay, we already had that in 1943, and it was called the Panther, so what? The British only caught up to the Panther by 1945, who cares? The thing about the Centurion was that this was only the beginning, so for the Panther, even its initial configuration was already quite overstressed. There was no room to upgrade the armament, there was no room to upgrade the armor. Really, the first Panthers and the last ones did not have very significant changes. Meanwhile, the Centurion Mark 1 was only the beginning. Even before the pilot batch of Centurion tanks had been completed, work already began on a tank with even thicker front armor, with 6 inches of front turret armor. This tank was called the Centurion 2. That was not the end. Work also began on a version of the Centurion with even more powerful armament. So rather than a 17-pounder gun, it would have a 20-pounder gun. This tank was designated Centurion Mark 3. Work was also underway on a Centurion Mark IV, which would have had a 95mm howitzer. But since the concept of close support tanks died off, the Centurion Mark IV died with it. So in the Centurion Mark III, the British received a truly powerful tank. It had better armament than the Panther. It had thicker frontal armor, well, on the side armor, really, than the Panther. And most importantly, it was much more reliable than the Panther. Throughout its entire service life, the Panther struggled with long marches. Meanwhile, the Centurion tanks could pull off a 2,000-mile march without needing an overhaul. So this was one very significant reason why the British liked this chassis so much. The Centurion actually remained in production until 1960s, and then the Centurion tanks that had been produced by that point were modernized for decades and decades, until actually, even to this day, variants of the Centurion still remain in service. By the end of 1945, the British had built not just a next-generation tank, but a next-generation tank platform. And there is absolutely no doubt that if the Second World War in Europe had lasted even a few months longer, let alone a few years, the Centurion would have hit the battlefield and absolutely excelled on it.